The rain fell heavy on the streets of Portland that October evening in 1954, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the neon signs of downtown diners and tobacco shops. Detective Frank Morrison stood outside the Riverside precinct, his fedora pulled low against the storm, watching the Willamette River turn dark and angry beneath the Morrison Bridge. He was 42 years old, with 17 years on the force and a reputation for being thorough, maybe too thorough according to some of his colleagues. Frank didn't care much what they thought. He had a daughter at home, Betty, just turned 16, and every case he worked, every body he found, reminded him that somewhere out there was another father's daughter, another mother's son. The call had come in at 6:47 p.m. A body discovered in Forest Park, just off the Wildwood Trail. Female, young, no identification. Frank crushed his cigarette under his shoe and headed back inside to grab his partner. Detective Ray Sullivan was younger, 31, fresh-faced despite 5 years working homicide. He had that optimism that Frank remembered having once, back before the war, before he'd seen what people were capable of doing to each other. They drove in silence through the winding roads leading up to Forest Park, the windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. The crime scene was already cordoned off when they arrived, portable lights casting long shadows through the Douglas firs and western hemlocks that towered overhead. The victim lay partially hidden beneath a fallen log, discovered by a university student who'd been taking a shortcut back to campus. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair matted against her pale face. She wore a yellow dress now mud-stained and torn, and a single pearl earring in her left ear. The right ear was empty. Frank knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the scene. Her hands were clean, nails manicured. This wasn't a transient or a working girl from Chinatown. This was somebody's daughter, probably from a good family. No purse, no wallet, no identification whatsoever. The medical examiner, Dr. Henry Carlson, arrived 20 minutes later. He was a methodical man in his 60s who'd seen Portland through Prohibition and the Depression. He examined the body with practiced efficiency while Frank and Ray took notes. Strangulation. Manual, based on the bruising pattern around her throat. Time of death approximately 12 to 16 hours prior. No signs of sexual assault, which struck Frank as odd. Most murders of young women in his experience had that component. This felt different, more personal somehow. They canvassed the area as best they could in the dark and rain, finding nothing but disturbed leaves and mud. No weapon, no signs of struggle beyond what had happened to the victim herself. Whoever had done this had either been incredibly lucky or incredibly careful. Back at the precinct, Frank pinned a photograph of the crime scene to the board in the detective's bullpen. The Portland Police Bureau was housed in a 4-story brick building downtown, constantly smelling of coffee, cigarette smoke, and the sweat of men working long hours for little pay. The next morning, they started making the rounds. Missing persons reports, dental records, anything that might give them an identity. Ray worked the phones while Frank visited the hospitals and morgues, checking if anyone had been asking about a missing girl. 3 days passed with nothing. The newspapers ran the story on page 6. A small article about an unidentified woman found dead in Forest Park. The editor at the Oregonian had called it a tragedy, but nothing scandalous enough for the front page. Portland liked to think of itself as a civilized city, not the kind of place where young women turned up murdered in the woods. On the 4th day, a woman walked into the precinct. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and she was looking for her daughter. Frank invited her into the interview room, a cramped space with green walls and a single window that looked out onto the parking lot. Margaret was in her late 40s, well-dressed in a navy suit and pearls, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. Her daughter's name was Elizabeth Whitmore, 20 years old, a junior at Reed College studying literature. She'd left their home in the West Hills neighborhood 5 days ago, saying she was going to study with friends. She never came home. Frank showed her the photograph they'd taken of the victim's face, cleaned up as best they could for identification purposes. Margaret's reaction told him everything he needed to know before she even spoke. Her hand went to her mouth, a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob escaping her throat. Yes, that was Elizabeth. That was her daughter. The Whitmore family lived in a beautiful colonial revival house on SW Fairview Boulevard, with a view of downtown and the river beyond. Elizabeth's father, Robert Whitmore, was a prominent attorney who'd made his fortune in real estate law during the post-war boom. The family had money, connections, and now a daughter who'd been found strangled in Forest Park. Frank and Ray interviewed the family for hours. Elizabeth had been a good student, popular, no known enemies. She'd been dating a young man named Michael Chen, a graduate student in chemistry at Portland State. Her parents approved of him, though Robert admitted with some discomfort that some of their friends in the neighborhood had raised eyebrows about Elizabeth dating a Chinese-American man. It was 1954, and Portland wasn't immune to the prejudices of the era. Despite its progressive reputation, they brought Michael in for questioning. He was 24, tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses and the nervous energy of someone who'd spent too many hours in laboratories. He'd been devastated when he heard about Elizabeth's death, genuinely shocked. His alibi checked out. He'd been working in the chemistry lab on campus the night Elizabeth disappeared, with 3 other graduate students who confirmed his presence until nearly midnight. Frank's instincts told him Michael wasn't their man. The grief was too real, too raw. This was someone who'd loved Elizabeth Whitmore, and was now trying to process a loss that made no sense. They interviewed Elizabeth's friends next. College students, mostly from comfortable families studying philosophy and art and literature at Reed College. They painted a picture of a vibrant young woman who loved Keats and Yeats, who wanted to be a writer someday, who'd talked about moving to New York after graduation. One friend, a girl named Patricia Summers, mentioned something interesting. 2 weeks before her death, Elizabeth had seemed distracted, worried about something. When Patricia asked what was wrong, Elizabeth had said something cryptic, that she'd learned something she wished she hadn't, something about someone she trusted. She never elaborated, and Patricia hadn't pushed. Now she regretted not asking more questions. Frank felt the first stirrings of something bigger here. This wasn't a random killing. Wasn't someone who'd grabbed a girl off the street. Elizabeth Whitmore had known something, had discovered something that had gotten her killed. But what? And by whom? The investigation hit its first major wall when the physical evidence came back from the lab. The yellow dress yielded no usable fingerprints beyond Elizabeth's own. The crime scene had been too contaminated by rain to preserve footprints or other trace evidence. The single pearl earring was a dead end. It had been purchased from Meyer and Frank department store downtown, sold by the hundreds to Portland's well-to-do families. Robert Whitmore called the precinct daily, demanding updates, applying pressure through his connections at City Hall. The mayor himself had called Frank's captain, emphasizing the importance of solving this case quickly. A murdered college student from a prominent family was bad for Portland's image, bad for business. Frank didn't care about Portland's image. He cared about finding whoever had wrapped their hands around Elizabeth Whitmore's throat and squeezed until she stopped breathing. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A janitor at Reed College named Thomas Burke had been cleaning out Elizabeth's dorm room at the request of her family when he found something wedged behind her desk drawer. A small notebook bound in red leather filled with Elizabeth's handwriting. Frank sat in his office reading through it page by page, Ray looking over his shoulder. Most of it was typical college student fare, notes from literature classes, fragments of poetry, observations about campus life. But the last 10 pages were different. They were dated from 2 weeks before her death, and they told a story that made Frank's blood run cold. Elizabeth had been doing research for a term paper on Portland's history during Prohibition. She'd interviewed several older residents of the city, including a man named Walter Hastings who owned a warehouse near the waterfront. During their conversation, Hastings had mentioned something about the old tunnels beneath Portland, the Shanghai tunnels as they were called, used for smuggling liquor in the 1920s. But then Hastings had said something else, something he'd quickly tried to take back. He'd mentioned that some business still happened down in those tunnels, business that certain powerful people in Portland wanted kept quiet. Elizabeth, being young and curious and perhaps naive about the dangers of digging into such things, had pressed him for details. Hastings had grown angry, told her to forget what he'd said and practically thrown her out of his office. But Elizabeth hadn't forgotten. The notebook detailed her attempts to investigate further. She'd spoken to a dock worker named Jimmy Reeves who'd been drunk enough to admit that merchandise still moved through those tunnels at night. Not liquor anymore, but other goods. Stolen property from the waterfront, contraband cigarettes, items that came off ships and never made it through customs. The final entry in the notebook was dated October 15th, the day before she disappeared. Elizabeth had written that she'd arranged to meet someone who could show her the tunnels, someone who'd agreed to give her information for her paper. The name wasn't written down, just the time and place. 8 p.m. at the old Morrison Street entrance near the Skidmore Fountain. Frank felt sick. Elizabeth Whitmore had walked into a trap thinking she was researching a college paper. Instead, she'd stumbled onto something that people were willing to kill to protect. He and Ray drove down to the waterfront district that afternoon. The Portland waterfront in 1954 was a different world from the polished streets of the West Hills. Here, longshoremen and sailors mingled with criminals and desperate men looking for work. The smell of fish and diesel fuel hung heavy in the air, and the sound of ship horns echoed across the Willamette. Walter Hastings' warehouse was a 3-story brick building that had seen better days. The windows on the upper floors were broken, and graffiti covered the loading dock doors. But when Frank knocked on the office entrance, a voice called out for them to enter. Hastings was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and suspicious eyes. He sat behind a desk covered in shipping manifests and cigarette ash, a bottle of bourbon within easy reach despite the early hour. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. He showed Hastings the red notebook and watched the man's face turn the color of old newspaper. Yes, Hastings admitted, Elizabeth Whitmore had come to see him. Yes, he'd said some things he shouldn't have, but he'd sent her away, told her to drop it. He hadn't seen her again after that. When Frank pressed him about what business was still happening in the tunnels, Hastings clammed up. Said he didn't know anything about that, had just been running his mouth to impress a pretty college girl. Frank didn't believe him, but without evidence there wasn't much he could do. They left Hastings' office and went looking for Jimmy Reeves, the dock worker Elizabeth had mentioned. They found him 3 hours later at a tavern on Burnside Street, already halfway through his daily drinking routine. Reeves was more talkative, especially after Ray bought him another whiskey. He confirmed that goods moved through the old tunnels, had been moving through them for years. He didn't know all the details, wasn't important enough to be let in on the whole operation. But he knew it involved some of the shipping companies, knew that certain customs inspectors looked the other way when containers came up light. When Frank asked if he'd heard about Elizabeth Whitmore's murder, Reeves's face went pale. He downed his whiskey in one gulp and said he didn't know nothing about that. Didn't want to know nothing about that. Then he left the bar so fast he knocked over his chair. Frank and Ray sat in silence, nursing their own drinks. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier. Elizabeth had asked questions about an illegal smuggling operation that was still running through Portland's historic tunnels. Someone had decided she was too much of a risk, too much of a loose end. But who? Who had Elizabeth met that night at the Morrison Street entrance? Who had lured her there and then killed her? The next day, Frank went to see the harbor master, a man named Douglas Fletcher who'd held the position for 15 years. Fletcher's office overlooked the river with a view of the ships coming and going, the lifeblood of Portland's economy. Fletcher was smooth, professional, completely unhelpful. He knew nothing about any smuggling operations. The Portland Harbor was one of the most efficiently run on the West Coast. If Detective Morrison had evidence of criminal activity, he should present it. Otherwise, Fletcher had work to do. Frank left feeling frustrated. He was getting stonewalled at every turn, running into walls built by money and influence and the unspoken rule that certain things in Portland simply weren't talked about. Ray suggested they go back to basics, retrace Elizabeth's last known movements. They spent a week interviewing everyone who might have seen her that final day. Her roommate at Reed, her professors, the librarian where she'd been studying, the waitress at the coffee shop where she'd eaten lunch. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a timeline. Elizabeth had left campus at 7:30 p.m., telling her roommate she had to meet someone for her research paper. She'd taken the streetcar downtown, getting off at the Skidmore Fountain stop at approximately 7:55 p.m. A street vendor selling roasted chestnuts remembered seeing a young woman in a yellow dress standing near the fountain, looking nervous, checking her watch. That was around 8:05 p.m. He'd noticed her because she seemed out of place in that neighborhood after dark, too well-dressed, too innocent. Then a black Cadillac had pulled up. The vendor couldn't see the driver clearly, but he saw the young woman get into the car. She hadn't seemed forced or afraid, just climbed in like she knew the person. The Cadillac had driven off heading north, and that was the last time anyone had seen Elizabeth Whitmore alive. Frank put out an APB for black Cadillacs, knowing it was a long shot. There were hundreds of them in Portland. Still, they had to try. Meanwhile, the pressure from Robert Whitmore was intensifying. He'd hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Arthur Brennan, to work the case independently. Brennan started showing up at the precinct, asking questions, stepping on toes. Frank didn't like him, didn't trust the way Brennan seemed more interested in protecting certain reputations than in finding Elizabeth's killer. One night, Frank worked late at the precinct, going through files, looking for any connection he might have missed. The building was quiet except for the night shift officers downstairs. He was studying a map of the tunnel system beneath Portland when he heard footsteps in the hallway. A man appeared in the doorway of the bullpen. He was in his early 30s, wearing a longshoreman's jacket and a cap pulled low. His face was shadowed, but his voice was clear enough. He told Frank that he knew who killed Elizabeth Whitmore. Said it was someone big, someone connected. Said Frank should be careful. That men had disappeared for asking fewer questions than the detective was asking. Then he dropped a name, Marcus Aldridge. Before Frank could ask anything else, the man was gone, footsteps echoing down the stairwell. Frank sat frozen at his desk. Marcus Aldridge. He knew that name. Everyone in Portland knew that name. Marcus Aldridge was one of the wealthiest men in Oregon. He owned shipping companies, real estate developments, had his fingers in half the businesses downtown. He was a philanthropist, donated to hospitals and schools. His wife hosted charity galas that raised thousands for various causes. He played golf with the mayor and the governor. And according to an anonymous tip from a scared longshoreman, Marcus Aldridge had something to do with Elizabeth Whitmore's murder. Frank knew he was in over his head now. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. This was about power, about money, about the hidden machinery that ran Portland behind its civilized facade. He thought about his daughter Betty, safe at home. He thought about Elizabeth Whitmore, who'd wanted to be a writer, who'd died because she'd been curious about the wrong things, and he knew he couldn't let this go, no matter how dangerous it became. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, smoking cigarette after cigarette, watching the dawn break over Portland's skyline. His wife Helen had given up trying to talk to him around midnight, retreating to their bedroom with a worried look that made his chest ache. He couldn't tell her what he was dealing with. Couldn't explain that he was about to go after one of the most powerful men in Oregon, with nothing but an anonymous tip and a dead girl's notebook. At 7 a.m., he drove to Ray's apartment in Selwood. His partner answered the door in his undershirt, hair sticking up, looking like he'd been dragged through hell. Frank told him about the visitor, about Marcus Aldridge's name. Ray listened, then poured them both coffee so strong it could strip paint. They need to be smart about this, Ray said. They couldn't just walk up to Aldridge's mansion in Dunthorpe and start asking questions about smuggling and murder. They needed evidence, something solid that even Aldridge's lawyers and political connections couldn't make disappear. Frank agreed. They started with property records. It took 3 days of digging through dusty files in the county clerk's office, but they found it. Marcus Aldridge owned the warehouse where Walter Hastings worked. He owned it through a shell corporation, layers of legal protection, but the trail led back to him eventually. More digging revealed that Aldridge owned several properties along the waterfront, all conveniently located near the old tunnel entrances. He also sat on the board of the Port of Portland, giving him influence over shipping schedules, customs inspections, everything that moved through the harbor. It was a perfect setup for smuggling. Goods could come off ships, move through the tunnels, end up in Aldridge's warehouses, all without official scrutiny. And anyone who threatened to expose it would face the full weight of Aldridge's power and connections. But they still needed proof. They needed something that directly linked Aldridge to Elizabeth Whitmore's death. Frank decided to take a risk. He went back to the waterfront, back to the bars and docks where men talked loosely after enough drinks. He asked questions carefully, never mentioning Aldridge's name directly, just following threads about the tunnel operations. On the 5th night, he met a man named Pete Kowalski in a dive bar on NW Front Avenue. Pete was a former tunnel runner who'd gotten out of the business 2 years ago after a close call with federal agents. He was bitter, angry at the people who'd made money off his risks while leaving him with nothing. After 4 whiskeys, Pete started talking. He told Frank about the operation, about how merchandise moved through the tunnels 3 or 4 nights a week, about how there was a whole system, lookouts, runners, drivers waiting at the other end, about how the money flowed up to someone important, someone nobody ever saw but everyone knew about. He'd heard rumors about the college girl. Word on the docks was that she'd gotten too close, started asking questions to the wrong people. Someone had arranged to meet her, someone she'd trusted because of their position in society. Then she'd disappeared, and everyone who worked the tunnels knew better than to talk about it. Pete wouldn't say who gave the orders, wouldn't confirm if it was Aldridge, but he gave Frank something better, a schedule. The next shipment was coming through in 2 nights, Thursday evening, starting at 10 p.m. Frank and Ray made their plan. They couldn't get official backup, not without alerting people who might warn Aldridge. The captain had already started asking uncomfortable questions about why Frank was spending so much time on the waterfront, instead of following more conventional leads. They would go into the tunnels themselves, document what they saw, get evidence that could force an investigation even Aldridge couldn't shut down. Thursday evening, Frank kissed Helen goodbye, hugged Betty a little longer than usual. His daughter looked at him with those 16-year-old eyes that saw more than he wanted them to. "Be careful, Daddy," she said. He promised her he would. Frank and Ray met at 10 p.m. near the entrance Pete had described, an old iron door hidden behind a pile of shipping pallets near the Burnside Bridge. They had flashlights, cameras with flashbulbs, and their service revolvers. Neither man said it out loud, but they both knew this could go very wrong. The tunnels were exactly as Frank had imagined them, damp, narrow passages that smelled of river water and decay. The walls were brick, crumbling in places, covered in decades of grime. Their footsteps echoed in the darkness. They'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when they heard voices ahead. Frank switched off his flashlight, Ray doing the same. They moved forward in darkness, guided by the distant glow of lanterns. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, probably part of the old basement system that connected the buildings downtown. 6 men were moving crates from one corridor to another, working with practiced efficiency. The crates were marked with shipping company logos that Frank recognized. He raised his camera, trying to get a clear shot. The flashbulb went off with a pop that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Everything happened fast after that. The men yelled, dropped their crates, reached for weapons. Frank and Ray identified themselves as police, but that only made things worse. Gunfire erupted in the tunnel, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like lightning. Frank felt a bullet whip past his head, so close he could feel the displacement of air. He and Ray returned fire, then ran, stumbling through the darkness as the smugglers gave chase. They burst out of a different tunnel entrance than they'd entered, emerging into an alley behind a warehouse. Ray had blood on his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. They made it to Frank's car and drove away with tires screaming. At the hospital, while a doctor stitched up Ray's shoulder, Frank developed the photographs he'd taken. Only one had come out clearly. A shot of the crates being moved with one man's face visible in the background. Frank didn't recognize him, but the image was proof that something illegal was happening in those tunnels. The next morning, before Frank could decide what to do with the evidence, he got a call. His captain wanted to see him immediately. Captain William Thornton was a career cop who'd worked his way up through the ranks over 30 years. He was a good man, mostly honest, but Frank could see the stress in his face as they sat down in his office. Thornton had received a complaint. Marcus Aldridge's lawyers had called, claiming that Detective Morrison had been harassing their client, making baseless accusations, damaging Mr. Aldridge's reputation in the community. The mayor was involved now, as was the police commissioner. Frank tried to explain about Elizabeth Whitmore, about the evidence he'd found, about what had happened in the tunnels. But Thornton held up his hand. There would be an internal investigation, the captain said. Frank was suspended, effective immediately. He needed to turn in his badge and gun. Frank sat in stunned silence. After everything, after getting shot at in those tunnels, they were shutting him down. Ray was waiting outside the captain's office. He'd already heard. They were benching both of them, claiming they'd gone rogue, endangered themselves unnecessarily. Frank drove home in a daze. He'd been a cop for 17 years, had worked hundreds of cases, and now he was suspended because he'd gotten too close to something that powerful people wanted buried. That evening, sitting in his living room with Helen beside him, holding his hand, Frank made a decision. He might not have his badge anymore, but that didn't mean he had to stop. Elizabeth Whitmore deserved justice, even if that justice had to come from outside the system. If you've made it this far in this story, if you're invested in seeing justice done for Elizabeth and watching Frank fight against a system stacked against him, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel, because what happens next, the way Frank decides to take on one of Oregon's most powerful men without his badge or the protection of the police department, that's where this story really begins to turn. Hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what comes next. Frank Morrison spent his first week of suspension like a caged animal. He'd wake at dawn out of habit, reach for his badge that wasn't there anymore, and feel the absence like a missing tooth his tongue kept finding. But suspension also meant freedom from the politics of the police bureau. No captain looking over his shoulder, no mayor's office calling with concerns. Just Frank, his instincts, and a murder that needed solving. He started where he should have started weeks ago, with Marcus Aldridge himself. The Aldridge estate sat on 5 acres in Dunthorpe, Portland's most exclusive neighborhood. The house was Georgian style, all white columns and manicured lawns, the kind of place that appeared in society pages when Constance Aldridge hosted her charity functions. Frank couldn't just knock on the door, but he could watch. He parked his Ford down the street, hidden behind an overgrown hedge, and observed. He documented everything. When Aldridge left for his office downtown, when he returned, who visited the estate, what cars came and went. On the 3rd day of surveillance, Frank noticed something interesting. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, a black Cadillac arrived at the estate around 7 p.m. The same Cadillac. The driver would go inside for exactly 1 hour, then leave. Frank followed the Cadillac when it departed. It drove to a modest house in the St. John's neighborhood, a working-class area near the industrial docks. The driver was a man in his 40s, average height, unremarkable except for one thing. Frank recognized him from the tunnel photograph. One of the men moving crates, his name was Vincent Marsh. Frank spent 2 days learning everything about him. Marsh worked officially as a warehouse supervisor for one of Aldridge's shipping companies. But his real job, Frank suspected, was managing the tunnel operations, being the middleman between Aldridge and the actual criminals doing the work. Frank needed leverage. He needed Marsh to talk, to confirm what he already suspected about Aldridge's involvement in Elizabeth's murder. The opportunity came on a Friday night. Marsh went to a bar in St. John's, one of those places where longshoremen drank away their paychecks. Frank waited until Marsh was 3 drinks in, then slid onto the bar stool beside him. He didn't announce himself as a cop, didn't have a badge to show anymore anyway. He just started talking, casual-like, about how tough it must be working for a man like Marcus Aldridge, always taking risks while the boss stayed clean, stayed protected. Marsh tensed, looked at Frank with wary eyes. Who was he? What did he want? Frank told him the truth. He was the detective who'd been investigating Elizabeth Whitmore's murder. The detective who'd been suspended for getting too close. The detective who had nothing left to lose, and he knew that Marsh had been there. Knew that Marsh had been involved somehow in Elizabeth's death. Marsh went pale. Started to stand up to leave, but Frank grabbed his arm, held him there. He told Marsh that he had evidence. Photographs from the tunnels. Witness statements. A timeline that put Marsh's Cadillac near Skidmore Fountain the night Elizabeth disappeared. It was only a matter of time before everything came out. Unless Marsh wanted to help himself. Unless he wanted to tell the truth before the walls came crashing down. Marsh stared into his whiskey glass for a long moment. Then he started talking, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth Whitmore had been asking questions, dangerous questions. She'd figured out about the smuggling operation, had names, details. Marsh had reported it to Aldridge during one of their regular meetings. Aldridge had been furious, said the girl was a threat that needed to be handled. Marsh swore he didn't know what Aldridge meant at first. He thought maybe they'd scare her, warn her off. But Aldridge had been specific. She needed to disappear permanently. Aldridge had arranged everything himself. He'd called Elizabeth, claimed to be a source who could give her information about Portland's history for her paper. He'd picked her up in his Cadillac, told her they were going somewhere quiet to talk. Instead, he'd driven her to a warehouse in northwest Portland. And there, when Elizabeth had realized something was wrong when she'd tried to leave, Aldridge had killed her. Wrapped his hands around her throat until she stopped struggling. Marsh had only found out afterwards. Aldridge had called him in a panic, told him to dispose of the body. Marsh had driven her to Forest Park in the middle of the night, left her where she'd eventually be found, but far enough from any connection to Aldridge. Frank felt his hands shaking as Marsh finished the story. Here it was. The truth. Marcus Aldridge, pillar of Portland society, had murdered a 20-year-old college student because she'd threatened his illegal enterprise. But Marsh's confession alone wouldn't be enough. Aldridge's lawyers would tear it apart. Marsh was a criminal himself, his word questionable. They needed more. Frank asked if Marsh would wear a wire, get Aldridge to talk about what happened. Marsh laughed bitterly, said Aldridge was too smart for that, too careful. He never spoke about Elizabeth's death, had made it clear that the subject was closed forever. There had to be another way. Frank thought about it all weekend, barely sleeping, his mind racing through possibilities. Then it came to him. The warehouse. The place where Elizabeth had died. There might still be evidence there, something that proved she'd been killed in that location. Monday morning, Frank went to see Ray. His former partner was back on desk duty, answering phones, doing paperwork. The suspension had hit Ray hard too, but he managed a grim smile when Frank walked into the precinct. They met for lunch at a diner on Burnside. Frank told him about Marsh's confession, about the warehouse. They needed to search it, needed to find proof. Ray pointed out the obvious problem. They had no warrant, no legal authority to search anything. If they went in illegally, any evidence they found would be inadmissible, unless they weren't the ones who found it. Frank called Robert Whitmore that afternoon. Elizabeth's father had grown gaunt and gray in the months since his daughter's death, the grief aging him a decade. But when Frank explained what he'd learned, what they needed to do, something sparked back to life in Robert's eyes. Rage, pure, focused rage. Robert Whitmore was still a powerful attorney with connections throughout Oregon's legal system. He filed a civil lawsuit against Marcus Aldridge, claiming wrongful death. It was a long shot, built on circumstantial evidence and Marsh's word, but it gave them something, the right to pursue discovery. And discovery meant they could legally search properties related to the case, including the warehouse where Marsh claimed Elizabeth had been killed. Aldridge's lawyers fought it, of course. Tried to get the case dismissed, but Robert Whitmore was relentless and he'd called in every favor he had. A judge ruled that the search could proceed. On a cold November morning, Frank and Ray accompanied Robert's legal team to the warehouse in northwest Portland. It was an old building, 3 stories of brick and broken windows, officially abandoned for the past 2 years. The forensic team spent 6 hours going over every inch of the first floor where Marsh said it had happened. For most of that time, they found nothing. Frank felt despair settling over him like fog off the river. Then one of the technicians, a young woman named Alice Chen, called out. She'd been examining the floorboards near an old loading dock, using luminol to check for blood traces. The entire section lit up blue under the chemical's glow. Someone had scrubbed the floor, tried to clean it thoroughly, but blood had seeped between the boards into the cracks and grain of the wood where no amount of cleaning could reach it. They pulled up the floorboards carefully. Beneath them, in the space between joists, they found more. A pearl earring, its mate to the one Elizabeth had still been wearing when they found her body. And a scrap of yellow fabric torn from her dress caught on a nail. Frank felt tears burning behind his eyes. Here was the proof. Elizabeth Whitmore had died in this place exactly as Marsh had said. The forensic team documented everything, photographed it, bagged it as evidence. The blood would need to be typed compared to Elizabeth's medical records. The fabric would need to be matched to her dress. But Frank knew what they'd find. That evening, Portland police arrested Marcus Aldridge at his estate in Dunthorpe. The charges were murder in the first degree. The arrest made headlines across Oregon. Portland's elite were shocked, couldn't believe that Marcus Aldridge, who'd donated millions to local causes, who'd been photographed shaking hands with senators and governors, could be a murderer, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marsh's testimony, The forensic findings in the warehouse, phone records showing Aldridge had called Elizabeth the day she died. His Cadillac matched the description from the chestnut vendor. Fibers from his car matched fibers on Elizabeth's dress. Aldridge's lawyers tried everything, claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that Marsh was lying to save himself, that the blood in the warehouse could have been from anyone. But piece by piece, witness by witness, the case against him solidified. The trial began in March of 1955. It lasted 3 weeks and dominated every newspaper in the state. Frank testified about the investigation, about the tunnels, about everything that had led him to Aldridge. Robert Whitmore sat in the gallery every day, watching the man who'd killed his daughter face justice. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a clear voice that carried through the packed courtroom. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Marcus Aldridge showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. But Frank, watching from the back of the courtroom, saw his hands tremble as the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs. The conviction of Marcus Aldridge sent shockwaves through Portland that lasted months. Federal investigators moved in immediately, dismantling the smuggling operation that had run through the city's tunnels for nearly a decade. 12 people were arrested in connection with the scheme, including 2 customs officials and a deputy harbor master who'd been taking bribes. Walter Hastings cooperated with authorities, receiving immunity in exchange for testimony about how the operation worked. Douglas Fletcher, the harbor master who'd stonewalled Frank during the investigation, resigned in disgrace when his financial records revealed payments from one of Aldridge's shell companies. Vincent Marsh received a reduced sentence of 10 years for his cooperation. Frank visited him once in prison, not out of forgiveness but out of a need to understand. Marsh looked smaller somehow behind bars, diminished. He told Frank that he'd never intended for any of it to go as far as it did. Started as just moving some merchandise, making extra money. By the time he understood what kind of man Aldridge really was, Marsh was in too deep to get out. When Aldridge told him to dispose of Elizabeth's body, he'd been terrified of what would happen if he refused. Frank didn't offer absolution. Elizabeth Whitmore was still dead. Her life cut short because grown men had chosen money over morality, convenience over courage. But he understood better how systems of corruption worked, how they trapped people and corrupted them gradually until they couldn't remember who they'd been before. The Portland Police Bureau underwent its own reckoning. An internal investigation revealed that several officers had accepted payments to ignore activity near the waterfront. 3 officers were fired, 2 more resigned before charges could be filed. Captain Thornton, to his credit, took responsibility for the political pressure that had led to Frank's suspension. He issued a formal apology and offered Frank his badge back with a commendation for solving one of the most significant cases in Portland's history. Frank thought about it for a week. Thought about what it meant to be a cop in a city where power and money could nearly bury the truth. Thought about all the Elizabeth Whitmores out there, vulnerable to predators who hid behind respectability and influence. He took the badge back, but he also made it clear that things would be different now. He wouldn't look away from uncomfortable truths. Wouldn't let politics dictate justice, Thornton agreed. The Bureau needed men like Frank Morrison, especially now, when public trust needed to be rebuilt. Ray Sullivan got his badge back too, though the bullet wound in his shoulder still ached on cold mornings, a permanent reminder of their night in the tunnels. He and Frank went back to being partners, working cases with the same thoroughness that had cracked the Whitmore investigation. They never talked much about those months, about how close they'd come to the case being buried forever, but there was an understanding between them now, a bond forged through shared danger and the knowledge that they'd done something that mattered. For Robert and Margaret Whitmore, justice didn't bring Elizabeth back. Nothing could. Their West Hills home remained painfully quiet. Elizabeth's room left exactly as it had been, a shrine to a daughter who'd never come home. But Robert threw himself into advocacy work. He established the Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation, which provided legal assistance to families whose loved ones had been murdered, especially in cases where the perpetrators had money or influence. He lobbied the state legislature for stronger oversight of port operations and reformed smuggling laws. Margaret was quieter in her grief. She planted a garden in Elizabeth's memory, roses and lilacs, the flowers her daughter had loved. She read Elizabeth's poetry, the fragments she'd left behind, and wondered what her daughter might have written if she'd been given the chance to grow old. Michael Chen, Elizabeth's boyfriend, graduated with his chemistry degree but left Portland shortly after. The city held too many painful memories. He moved to San Francisco, eventually married, had children, but he never forgot the girl who'd wanted to be a writer, who'd died pursuing the truth. Frank made sure to visit the Whitmores regularly, updating them on the aftermath of the case, bringing them small pieces of closure. He told them about every smuggler arrested, every corrupt official exposed, every reform implemented because of what Elizabeth had uncovered. It didn't ease their pain, but it gave meaning to their loss. Elizabeth hadn't died for nothing. Her curiosity, her courage in asking difficult questions, had exposed a network of corruption that might have continued for years otherwise. The broader Portland community struggled to process what had happened. Marcus Aldridge had been one of them, part of the city's elite. His conviction forced uncomfortable conversations about who they chose to trust, what lay beneath the surface of respectability. Constance Aldridge divorced her husband 3 months after his conviction. She left Oregon entirely, moving to her sister's home in Connecticut. Before she left, she came to see the Whitmores, an unexpected visit that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Constance wept in their living room, apologizing for her husband's actions even though she'd known nothing about them. She'd thought she was married to a successful businessman, a community leader. Instead, she'd shared her life with a murderer. Margaret held the other woman's hands and told her that evil could hide anywhere, could wear any face. Neither of them was responsible for the choices Marcus Aldridge had made. The criminal trial had revealed disturbing details about Aldridge's psychology. Psychiatrists testified that he'd shown signs of narcissistic personality disorder, an inability to feel genuine empathy, a belief that rules existed for other people but not for him. He'd built an empire through charm and ruthlessness, and when a 20-year-old college student threatened that empire, he'd eliminated her with the same cold calculation he applied to business decisions. In prison, Aldridge maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. He gave interviews claiming he'd been framed, that powerful enemies had conspired against him. But as the years passed and his appeals were rejected one by one, his protests grew quieter. Frank followed Aldridge's imprisonment from a distance. The man would die in prison exactly as he deserved, but Frank took no pleasure in it. The whole case had shown him the darkness that could exist in seemingly ordinary places, the violence that could hide behind expensive suits and charitable donations. Reed College established a scholarship in Elizabeth's name for students studying journalism and literature. They wanted to honor her curiosity, her courage to ask difficult questions. Each year, a new student received funding to pursue investigative projects, to dig into stories that needed telling. Patricia Summers, Elizabeth's friend who'd noticed her distraction in those final weeks, became one of the first recipients. She went on to become an investigative journalist for the Oregonian, spending her career exposing corruption and giving voice to the powerless. She said Elizabeth had inspired her, shown her that pursuing truth mattered even when it was dangerous. The Shanghai tunnels, once used for smuggling and crime, became part of Portland's tourist history. The city gave guided tours of the underground passages, telling sanitized stories about prohibition and the rough waterfront past. But locals who'd lived through the Aldridge case knew the tunnel's more recent history, the darkness that had flowed through them until Frank Morrison and Ray Sullivan had shined a light into those depths. For Frank himself, the case changed something fundamental. He'd always believed in the justice system, in the idea that truth would prevail. The Whitmore investigation had tested that belief, shown him how close truth could come to being buried forever. He became more careful after that, more thorough. He documented everything, kept copies of files in multiple locations, built cases that couldn't be dismantled by political pressure. Other detectives started coming to him for advice on difficult cases, especially those involving powerful suspects. His daughter Betty was 18 now, preparing to start at University of Oregon in the fall. She'd watched her father go through the suspension, the investigation, the trial. She'd seen him risk everything for a girl he'd never met, a victim who couldn't speak for herself. One evening, sitting on their porch watching the sunset over Portland, Betty told Frank she was proud of him. Proud that he'd done the right thing even when it was hard, even when everyone told him to let it go. Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. He'd spent months wondering if pursuing the case had been worth the cost, worth the danger he'd put himself and Ray in. But hearing his daughter say those words, seeing the person she was becoming, he knew the answer. Helen, his wife, had supported him through everything despite her fears. She'd never asked him to drop the case, never suggested his career was more important than finding justice for Elizabeth Whitmore. Their marriage was stronger for it, built on shared values and mutual respect. The Whitmore case became legendary in Portland law enforcement circles. New detectives studied it in training, learning about persistence, about following evidence wherever it led, about standing up to pressure from powerful interests. Frank gave lectures sometimes at the police academy, walking young officers through the investigation. He emphasized the importance of treating every victim with dignity, whether they came from the West Hills or the waterfront. He talked about how corruption thrived in darkness and died in light. Years later, Frank would look back on the case as the defining moment of his career. Not because of the publicity or the commendations, but because it had tested everything he believed about justice and found that those beliefs, though battered, could survive. Elizabeth Whitmore had been dead for months before Frank Morrison ever heard her name. But in solving her murder, in refusing to let her death disappear into convenient silence, he'd given her a voice that echoed long after she was gone. And in Portland, whenever young people asked difficult questions or dug into uncomfortable truths, there were those who remembered the college student who'd paid with her life for her curiosity, and the detective who'd made sure her death wasn't in vain. October 1974, 20 years later. The autumn rain fell on Portland just as it had 2 decades before, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected a city transformed. The waterfront had been renovated, the old warehouses converted into shops and galleries. The Shanghai tunnels were now officially recognized historical sites, their dark past sanitized for tourist consumption. Frank Morrison was 62 years old now, his hair completely gray, his face lined with the years. He'd retired from the Portland Police Bureau 3 years earlier with full honors, after 35 years of service. They'd thrown him a party at the precinct, presented him with a plaque that hung in his study at home. But retirement hadn't slowed him down much. He consulted on cold cases, taught at the police academy, and volunteered with the Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation that Robert Whitmore had built into one of Oregon's most respected advocacy organizations. This morning, Frank stood in Lone Fir Cemetery in southeast Portland, umbrella held against the rain, looking down at a headstone that read, Elizabeth Ann Whitmore, 1934-1954, beloved daughter, seeker of truth. He came here every year on the anniversary of the day they'd found her body. It had become a ritual, a way of remembering why the work mattered. Ray Sullivan stood beside him, his own umbrella dripping. Ray had retired the same year as Frank, the two partners finishing their careers together as they'd worked so many cases together. Ray's shoulder still bothered him on rainy days, the old bullet wound aching with the weather. They didn't need to speak. After so many years as partners, words were often unnecessary. They stood in silence, paying their respects to a girl they'd never known in life, but who'd changed both of their lives forever. A car pulled up on the cemetery road. Robert Whitmore emerged, moving slower than he had 20 years ago, but still carrying himself with dignity. He was 74 now, his legal career long behind him, but the foundation kept him busy. He'd helped dozens of families find justice for murdered loved ones, using his connections and resources to ensure that power and money didn't bury the truth. Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier, her heart finally giving out under the accumulated weight of grief. Robert had scattered her ashes in the rose garden she'd planted for Elizabeth, the flowers still blooming every spring. Robert joined Frank and Ray at the gravestone. The 3 men had formed an unlikely bond over the years, united by their connection to Elizabeth and their commitment to her memory. After a few minutes, Robert spoke. His voice was weathered but strong. He told them that the foundation had just helped close a case in Eugene, a 15-year-old murder that had gone cold because the suspect was a prominent doctor. The family finally had justice, finally had closure. Elizabeth's legacy continued. Frank felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. This was why they'd fought so hard, why they'd risked everything. One case had rippled outward, creating change that lasted decades. They left the cemetery together, stopping for coffee at a diner on Hawthorne Boulevard. The neighborhood had changed completely since the 50s, become younger and more vibrant. But some things remained constant. Good coffee, honest conversation, the bonds between people who'd seen darkness together and chosen to fight it. Ray mentioned that he'd heard Marcus Aldridge had died in prison the previous month. Heart attack at 71. There'd been a small obituary in the paper, mostly factual, mentioning his business success and his conviction without dwelling on either. Frank felt nothing hearing the news. No satisfaction, no sense of closure. Aldridge had spent 20 years in prison, died behind bars as a convicted murderer. Justice had been served as fully as it could be. What mattered more was what had changed because of the case. The reforms in port oversight, the increased scrutiny of powerful figures, the message sent that no one was above accountability. Betty, Frank's daughter, was now 38 and a public defender in Seattle. She'd chosen law because of what she'd watched her father go through during the Whitmore investigation. She represented the powerless against the powerful, gave voice to those who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. She visited regularly, bringing Frank's 3 grandchildren to spend weekends in Portland. The oldest, Elizabeth, named after the girl whose case had defined her grandfather's career, was 15 now, already showing signs of the same fierce curiosity and sense of justice that had gotten the original Elizabeth killed. Frank worried about her sometimes, worried that the world was still dangerous for young women who asked too many questions. But he also took pride in her spirit, her refusal to accept easy answers. The Elizabeth Whitmore Scholarship at Reed College had funded 46 students over the past 20 years. Many had gone on to careers in journalism, law, and public service. A reunion had been held the previous spring, and Frank had attended, meeting young people who'd been inspired by a woman they'd never known, whose death had paradoxically given life to their ambitions. Patricia Summers, Elizabeth's college friend, had become one of the Oregonians' most respected investigative journalists. Her series on police corruption in smaller Oregon cities had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1968. She'd written a book about the Whitmore case 10 years after the trial, donating all proceeds to the foundation. Frank had read the book with mixed emotions. Patricia had captured the details accurately, but reading about those months brought back memories he'd preferred to leave buried. The fear he'd felt in those tunnels, the desperation when he'd been suspended, the rage when he'd learned how Aldridge had killed Elizabeth. But Patricia had also captured something important: the idea that ordinary people, doing their jobs with integrity and courage, could challenge even the most powerful institutions. That truth, though fragile and easily threatened, could survive if enough people fought for it. Michael Chen, Elizabeth's boyfriend, had returned to Portland for the 20th anniversary memorial service that the foundation had organized. He was 54 now, a chemistry professor at Berkeley with grown children of his own. He'd brought his daughter, named Elizabeth in his lost love's honor. The memorial service had been held at Reed College in the same library where Elizabeth had studied during her brief life. Over 200 people attended: family, friends, former investigators, foundation beneficiaries, scholarship recipients, people whose lives had been touched in various ways by Elizabeth's story. Frank had spoken at the service, keeping his remarks brief. He'd talked about Elizabeth as a person, not just a victim, a young woman who'd loved poetry and wanted to change the world through writing, who'd been curious and brave and ultimately too trusting of someone she'd thought she could trust. He'd reminded everyone that Elizabeth hadn't set out to expose corruption or become a martyr. She'd simply been a college student researching a paper, but her death had revealed something important about Portland, about how power operated in the shadows. And in revealing it, she'd helped change it. Now, sitting in the diner with Ray and Robert, Frank reflected on how much had changed and how much remained the same. Portland was different, more transparent, more accountable. But power still corrupted and the vulnerable still needed protecting. The work was never finished. It couldn't be, but each case solved, each truth revealed, each small victory for justice mattered. They accumulated over time, shifting the balance incrementally toward light. Ray mentioned that his oldest son had just joined the Portland Police Bureau, starting his career as a patrol officer. Frank felt a surge of hope hearing that. The next generation carrying forward the lessons learned, the values tested and proven. Robert shared that the foundation was expanding, opening a satellite office in Salem to serve families throughout the Willamette Valley. They'd helped over 300 families in 20 years, closing cases, providing legal support, ensuring that justice wasn't just for those who could afford it. Before they parted ways, Robert thanked Frank and Ray again for everything they'd done, for not giving up when it would have been easier and safer to let the case go cold, for risking their careers and their lives because a young woman they'd never met deserved justice. Frank brushed off the thanks, uncomfortable as always with praise. He'd just done his job, done what any decent cop should do. But Robert insisted what they'd done was extraordinary, and Elizabeth's memory lived on because of their courage. Driving home through the rain, Frank thought about all the lives that had intersected because of that October night in 1954. Elizabeth, whose death had seemed like it might disappear into convenient silence. Aldridge, whose power had nearly been enough to bury the truth. Vincent Marsh, who'd made terrible choices and paid for them. Robert and Margaret Whitmore, whose grief had transformed into purpose, and himself and Ray, two detectives who'd decided that badges and careers mattered less than doing what was right. The case had taught Frank that justice wasn't inevitable. It required people willing to fight for it, sometimes at great personal cost. It required institutions willing to be held accountable. It required a society that valued truth more than convenient lies. Portland in 1974 wasn't perfect. No city was, but it was better than it had been in 1954, in part because Elizabeth Whitmore's death hadn't been allowed to disappear, hadn't been swept under the rug by powerful men protecting their interests. That evening, Frank sat in his study, looking at the plaque from his retirement party, the commendations from the Whitmore case, the photographs of his family. Helen brought him coffee, kissed the top of his head, reminded him that their granddaughter's recital was next weekend. This was the life he'd built. Simple, honest, grounded in relationships and purpose. The Whitmore case had been the defining moment of his career, but it wasn't all he was. He was also a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man who'd tried his best to leave the world a little better than he'd found it. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Portland, washing the streets clean, the eternal cycle of the Pacific Northwest. Somewhere in the city, new detectives were working new cases, facing new challenges. Some would confront power and corruption. Some would have to decide whether career or conscience mattered more. Frank hoped they'd choose wisely. Hoped they'd remember cases like Elizabeth Whitmore's. Remember that every victim deserves someone willing to fight for them, regardless of the cost. The story of Elizabeth Whitmore and the detective who'd refused to let her death be forgotten had become part of Portland's history, a reminder of both the city's dark past and its capacity for justice and redemption, and in that reminder lay hope. That truth, though fragile, could survive. That justice, though difficult, was possible. That ordinary people, through courage and integrity, could challenge even the most powerful forces, and sometimes, against all odds, they could win.